Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar, The Economic, Social, and Environmental Impacts of Transit Infrastructure on Regional Economies. We do apologize for our delay in beginning, a few technical difficulties, but we are very proud to be joined today by our guest speakers from KPMG, Dr. Federico Garcia, Alice Yu, and Andrew Comodento. Dr. Federico Garcia is a managing director at KPMG. He has provided economic consulting to government agencies and the private sector. He has led projects for agencies in the U.S. Department of Transportation in several states, and Federico has a PhD in economics. Dr. Alice Yu is a manager in the economic and statistical consulting practice of KPMG, where she serves clients in both public and commercial sectors. Alice earned her PhD in economics and specializes in data analytics and economic impact analyses. Rounding off the KPMG team, we have Andrew Comodento, a senior associate at KPMG with a background in economic impact analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and econometrics. He has applied economic analysis methods to numerous projects in transportation infrastructure sector. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from George Mason University and a master's degree in applied economics from Georgetown University. Joining our guest speakers from the REMI team will be Peter Evangelakis and Haji Guan. Dr. Evangelakis is a vice president in economics and consulting at REMI. Since joining REMI in 2017 of September, he has managed REMI's team of economists, contributed to the economic modeling software development, served as principal investigator on numerous projects, presented multiple presentations, and leads REMI's consulting practices from our Washington, D.C. office. Peter holds a PhD and master's degree in economics from University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics from Swarthmore College. Finally, Haji Guan is an economic analyst at REMI. During her time here, she has worked on several economic research and data analysis projects, and she holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University and specializes in economics. I would like to thank all of our speakers for being here with us today. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity to have your questions answered. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A submission portal, and our presenters will answer them following the prepared discussion. For your convenience, all registrants for this webinar will receive direct access to the slides and recording via follow-up email. Please keep an eye out for it later this afternoon, as it will go to the same email address used to register for today's event. Without further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. Garcia to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you, Dee, and thank you everybody for joining us. Let's turn to page 2. The backdrop for this project is the expectation that the federal government will boost infrastructure spending, including in public transit. But also there is a growing interest in not only the economic, but also the environmental and social equity impacts of public investments. In this project, we focused on 3 transit investments. The first was bus electrification, the second, fixed Guideway transit, and the third, bicycle infrastructure. And a disclaimer is that this work is not meant to be used for public policy advocacy. And we limited the analysis to the macro contributions, along with the environmental and social equity impacts. And this work is not intended to be a benefit cost analysis or a comprehensive estimate of net benefits. Next slide, please, slide number 3. So a bit more on the background. So KPMG and REMI collaborated to explore these issues using the REMI model along with quantitative analysis. And sort of a big picture lens here is that this analysis demonstrates the viability of extending a regional input-output model to capture more than the economic impacts, but also the workforce, social equity, and environmental outcomes. And it can serve as a tool for policymakers and transit agencies to evaluate projects. And this is particularly important as federal agencies focus on a broader set of contributions when funding infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Number 4. So Our work is focused on the Washington, D.C. metro area. And the area provides excellent use cases because of its size, its diversity of transit infrastructure, and the vast amount of data availability. But although we focused on the Washington, D.C. metro area, our analysis, we believe, has broader implications for how transportation agencies can leverage federal funding to spur economic recovery in the short term, but also transformational growth in the medium and long terms. And the investment scenarios that we used were built using existing proposals and available data to come up with realistic measures of contributions. So the first one, the bus electrification scenario, consists of replacing the current bus fleet, which is mainly diesel and natural gas, entirely with electric buses. And bus electrification is expected to yield substantial reductions in emissions, as you will see later in the presentation. The second scenario is fixed Guideway transit.
Apologies, Federico. I just wanted to note, if we can move back a slide.
Sure.
I just wanted to make sure it was lining up with the discussion. Please proceed. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, sure. So yeah, so we are now on the use cases slide, and now we go on to the second scenario, which is a fixed Guideway transit, and that scenario consists of completing the Purple Line project in the DC metro area. And this investment is expected to divert car trips to transit and to reduce negative externalities from car travel. Moving on to the next slide. The third and final scenario is a significant expansion of the bicycle trail and lane network in the DC metro area. And this investment is expected to shift some of the car trips to bicycles. We focused on transportation benefits. We did not include all possible benefits, for example, health benefits or impacts on property value. All right, so I will now turn it over to my colleague, Andrew Komendantov, who will discuss our data and approach. Andrew?
Thank you, Federico. So moving on to the next slide, I will, as Federico mentioned, I will go over the data and the study approach, the development of scenarios, and the data inputs that were then input into the REMI model. So moving on to the next slide, with the study approach, our study approach can be summarized through basically 5 steps. With the first one is we conducted the background research to determine transit investments and the geographic areas to study, specifically focusing on transit investments that will be representative and scenarios that will be representative of transit investments in reality. This is especially, importantly tailored to reflect the grants that MPOs and similar organizations may be looking to apply for, especially considering, as Federico mentioned, the expected infusion of federal dollars through upcoming legislation. And these scenarios, they may involve building new infrastructure or rehabilitating existing assets. So in this process, we've selected the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and we've selected 3 different transit investments. Upon doing that, we then analyzed the macroeconomic contributions of these transit investments, specifically estimating the GDP, jobs, and disposable income per household changes. Then we analyzed the equity contributions and characterized the distributional impacts. These contributions can be quantified as economic benefits to households of varying levels of income, as well as the impacts and the benefits to various racial and ethnic groups. Then we estimated the workforce development benefits, which were measured as changes in labor force participation rate, the unemployment rate, and wage growth. Finally, we've analyzed the environmental contributions of these investments, specifically looking at the reduction in carbon emissions, but also evaluating the impact to other emission reductions, such as sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide reductions. So moving on to our next slide, the first scenario that we looked at was the bus electrification scenario. And this scenario assumes that WMATA's bus fleet would be replaced by electric buses, and additionally the service will be expanded to account for the implementation of bus rapid transit along critical routes. This analysis used the best available estimates of electric bus and charging infrastructure costs, as well as the best available estimates of operating costs per mile for each bus type. We assume that the electrification of WMATA's bus fleet will take 5 years, starting in 2022 and ending in 2026, with the construction of bus rapid transit conducted concurrently. We also assume that this initiative would be entirely paid for with federal funding, the expenditures would be made evenly throughout the period. The costs that were categorized as construction and O&M costs, which included the costs of purchasing vehicles as well as adding charging infrastructure. And the benefits were categorized as O&M cost savings and the change in energy consumption. The O&M cost savings, they were simply taking the difference between the existing operating costs of the existing bus fleet and the difference between that and the proposed electric bus fleet, while also taking into account the changes the changes driven by expanding the network through bus rapid transit. And the change in energy consumption was measured in billions of BTU, and it's simply the difference between the energy consumption of the current fossil fuel powered fleet and the electric fleet. So moving on to the next slide, the next scenario that we considered was the fixed Guideway transit scenario. And this scenario used the Purple Line project to illustrate the socioeconomic contributions of a fixed Guideway transit project. The Purple Line is an ongoing project that spans Prince George's and Montgomery counties in Maryland and the aim of it is to add a light rail connection between the two counties while also connecting the existing radial metro rail lines in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. This would provide a new connection between the two counties, but also can yield substantial time savings for existing transit riders, as they would be able to go from one county to another without going through the downtown Washington, D.C. urban core. So this analysis, it relies on the projections of the Purple Line Economic Development Report, and some adjustments were made to account for the changes in conditions since this report was published. The construction is expected to be completed in 2023, and revenue service is expected to start in 2024, with a 2-year ramp up in ridership expected at the start. Again, this project is expected to be paid entirely with federal funding, and the costs are expected to be expended evenly throughout the remainder of the construction period. The costs were classified as capital and O&M costs, and the benefits were classified as changes in vehicle trips, vehicle hours traveled, vehicle miles traveled, as well as changes in ridership, passenger hours traveled, and passenger miles traveled as a result of the project. Moving on to the next slide, our final scenario is the bicycle infrastructure scenario. And this scenario assumes a significant expansion of the existing bicycle trail and lane network in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan statistical area. And we based our scenario off of the 2015 bicycle and pedestrian plan for the National Capital Region. This plan calls for an increase, a pretty significant increase in build out of the bicycle lane and trail network, amounting to an average of 31.7 miles of bicycle lanes and 32 miles of shared use paths constructed every year. To put it into perspective, this is significantly larger than the existing pace of expansion, which amounts to about 11 miles of bicycle lanes and 12 miles of shared use paths constructed per year. This scenario, it assumes an average annual pace of construction throughout the period, the analysis period, and estimates the socioeconomic contributions of bicycle network expansion between years 2022 and 2031, as with the other scenarios. Again, with the other scenarios, we've assumed that this would be entirely paid for with federal funding, and we also assume that there would be no maintenance costs during our analysis period, so no repaving of the newly built paths. The costs, they consisted of capital costs sourced from the bicycle and pedestrian plan, and the benefits, they consisted of changes in vehicle miles traveled, as well as option value and user benefits. Changes in vehicle miles traveled, they were calculated leveraging existing research on mode shift from automobiles to bicycles as a result of bicycle lane network expansion. And the option value used half of the transportation diversity value applied to the projected VMT reduction, and user benefits were calculated as the willingness to pay, estimated as the willingness to pay for the use of a bicycle trail, which were then applied to the number of trips shifted from automobiles to bicycles. So with these scenarios and the inputs that we developed, we then input them into the REMI model, and I will hand it over to Peter Evangelakis to talk about the REMI model framework.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, so I want to talk in the next couple of slides about the REMI model and how it was used in this particular scenario. In this slide, I'll give an overview of the structure of the model and some of the key relationships that were leveraged in these analyses. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the specific modeling tools that were used within the REMI suite. What you can see on this slide is basically a high-level schematic of how the model is structured and basically how it models the economy and the population. And so just to give a brief overview, it's split into these 5 blue blocks. The top one, output and demand, is just a picture of the macroeconomy. So output and GDP, basically. And then number 2 is right in the middle, labor and capital demand. That's a model of businesses making hiring and investment decisions based on things like wages and labor productivity. Number 3, population and labor supply, which is to the left middle, has population dynamics, both driven by births and deaths, as well as economic migration that changes populations in different regions, and that's driven by economic conditions. And we also have labor force dynamics with detailed participation rates and pictures of the labor force. And all of these are broken out by detailed gender, age, and racial categories. Number 4, the bottom, compensation, prices, and costs, is pretty self-explanatory. It talks about a lot of the different costs and prices that we see in the economy that are operating in the markets of interest. So, for example, compensation rates in different industries, the prices of different consumer goods categories, housing prices, and several others. We also see production costs, what you can think of as business costs. Again, that's by industry, by region kind of metric. That drives prices. It also drives regional economic competitiveness, which is how you can think of the domestic and international market share in that 5th box on the right middle. And regional competitiveness feeds right back into the ability of a particular region to compete and to produce more goods and services and to kind of grow the economic pie. So some key dynamics that I'd like to highlight from here that were operational in our analyses. First of all is kind of spending. So kind of direct economic output, GDP, injected into the economy through construction, manufacturing, and other spending. So that basically directly impacts the gross regional product. We also we see that spending driving an increased demand for employment, and you can kind of see that schematically if you squint and look closely. at the schematic. And of course, driving more employment also means an increase in income and disposable income. And those are the key macroeconomic metrics that we're going to be showing you in the results. Another key dynamic, as Federico and Andrew mentioned, is improvements to labor access, which drive improvements to labor productivity through better matching and job availability, which lowers costs for businesses, and as I just said, makes the region more competitive and kind of grows the economic pie. And finally, another is what we call the amenity value, and that comes in several different forms in some of the different scenarios, through emissions reductions, through improvements in safety, leisure time, and a number of other measures of quality of life that drive economic migration into the region, driving population and the kind of commensurate consumer spending that also drives demand, necessitates increases in hiring and more income. So when you're looking at when you're thinking through the results that we'll show you very shortly, those are some of the key mechanisms that are going on. So next slide, please. And the specific models that were used are the REMI TranSight model, which has been used for a number of years by many clients from the U.S. and state departments of transportation and many MPOs and regional planning commissions at the local level, and as well as REMI's newest offering, our DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion model, that allowed us to capture from the TranSight side the impact of improvements to the transportation network that allowed for improvements in access. And then the DEI module allowed us to capture the benefits, not just to the macroeconomy, but also breaking them down, for example, employment by race and gender, by education level, by income quintile, impact on the income distribution itself, as well as labor force participation by race and gender. And just at the bottom of the slide, you can see kind of a schematic of taking the input data that Andrew described, turning it into model inputs, both in terms of spending, as well as the various amenity benefits, such as emission savings, safety, travel time savings, as well as reductions in the costs of transportation, and how those translate into the economic and demographic results, as well as some of these distributional social equity results. So I'm going to be now turning the presentation over to our analyst, our REMI analyst who ran the simulations, Hao-Jie. She's going to describe in detail the results from the bus electrification scenario. For time purposes, we're not going to share that same level of detailed discussion for all three scenarios, but we will, in the conclusion section, have a table that summarizes all of the results from all of the scenarios, and Alice Yu from KPMG will provide a thorough discussion of all of the scenarios. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hao-Jie.
Thank you, Peter. So for the findings part, if we could move on to the next slide. And there are many 4 aspects, including macroeconomic contributions, equity impacts, workforce development, and environmental contributions. And we can move on to the next slide to show the macroeconomic contributions. As we can see from the table, on average, over 1,100 jobs are supported annually, and there are 184 million increase in gross regional product in year 2031, and it generates 980 million in disposable personal income over the analysis period. Next slide, please. And this table shows the top 10 industries in terms of job increase. The 10-year average job increases are sorted from the largest to the smallest, we find that most of the jobs created are in the maintenance and construction sectors, with the state and local government, retail, and healthcare services, among others, benefiting as well. And note that the electrification is assumed to take 5 years. After 2026, the construction and manufacturing is complete, and then the ongoing maintenance and repair work begins. So that's why we see a bigger jump in the employment in year 2027. Next slide, please. And this table breaks down the total employment into direct, indirect, and induced employment. Direct and induced employment are the major components, with an average of 485 direct jobs and 628 induced jobs per year. The induced jobs are mainly supported by increased labor income, improved labor access, and other dynamic economic responses. Next slide, please. For the equity contributions, the left chart shows employment by income quintiles. So we find that 80% of employment gains benefit workers in the lowest 20%, which is in the gray bar, and the second 20%, which is in the yellow bar. The right chart shows the employment by race. Approximately 50% of new jobs are expected to benefit ethnic and racial minorities. Among minority groups, Hispanic workers, which is in green bar, benefit from over 20% of the total jobs gained during construction phase. And during the operation phase, Black workers, which is in purple bar, benefit the most, accounting for approximately 21% of all new jobs. Next slide, please. We also find a larger labor market with diverse demographic groups. The right chart shows an expanded labor pool with the unemployment rate dropping by 0.03% on average. The left chart shows higher labor participation rate for all races, as you can see, especially for the white and Black workers, which is in the blue and also in the purple bar. Next slide, please. And this chart shows the compensation rate by income quintile. The second lowest income quintile expected to benefit the most, especially during the construction phase, and all other quintiles expected to benefit as well. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the workforce development contributions, and this chart shows jobs by educational attainment. As we can see, there are many categories. The bachelor's degree is in the purple bar, and everything below it will be jobs created that do not require bachelor degree, which accounts for about 76%. The high school diploma in yellow bar expected to be the most common education requirement. Next slide, please. And here we have environmental contributions as well. As the chart shows, there are 3 parts of these bars. The purple part is the growth in emissions driven by electricity consumption. Below the zero line, we have declines in natural gas and diesel CO2 emissions as they are being replaced by electricity. The line graph is capturing the net effect. Here we are quantifying CO2 emissions based on the social cost of carbon. We find that it reduces emissions by an average of 1.5 million per year and up to 2 million by year 2031. And that concludes the findings part for the bus electrification case. And let me hand it over to Alice to do the conclusion.
Thank you, Haozhiyi. To conclude today's presentation, we compare the 3 transit investment scenarios by looking at their economic, equity, and environmental contributions, as well as contributions per dollar spent. Slide 39, please. On the top 3 rows of this table, we summarize the costs of each scenario, including net capital cost, net O&M cost, and total cost, which is the sum of the two. Moving on to the next bucket of the table, we summarize total economic contribution and labor force contributions. The contributions to labor market are measured by job created, and the equity impacts are measured by share of jobs without bachelor's degree and share of jobs benefiting ethnic and racial minorities. Macroeconomic contributions include increase in gross regional product, GRP, and disposable personal income. Environmental contributions are captured by emissions avoided. The third bucket on this table shows the contributions per dollar spent, which reflects the idea of return on investment. Contributions per dollar spent are calculated by total contributions divided by total cost spent. To quickly summarize these findings, a fixed Guideway transit project yields the largest numbers of jobs, GRP, and labor income per dollar spent. It is expected to create the most jobs that benefit minorities. The bus electrification scenario is the most effective at reducing emissions, while there is a significant leakage of spending beyond the study area, diminishing the regional economic contributions per dollar spent. Finally, the bicycle infrastructure scenario yields a less expensive alternative to reducing emissions than the other two scenarios, and it is relatively efficient at boosting the regional economy, generating $1 of GRP per dollar spent and 9.4 jobs per $1 million spent. Please do not worry if you cannot read through all these numbers. In the next few slides, we will recap what we have learned through this study. Moving on to the next slide, we found the bus electrification scenario to be the most effective when it comes to reducing emissions. It supports over 1,100 jobs annually, with a total increase of $1.3 billion in GRP and $980 million in disposable personal income. The expansion of the labor force contributes to a decrease of unemployment rate of 0.03%. The bus electrification scenario also provides substantial job opportunities, with 50% of these jobs benefiting racial and ethnic minorities. Hispanic workers see the largest employment gains. In addition, this scenario increases compensation for all workers, especially the second lowest quintile from the expansion in construction. Workers with lower educational attainment are provided with more job opportunities. About 76% of the newly employed would not need a bachelor's degree, compared to the 62% of the workforce in the DC metro area. Last but not least, this scenario shows a decrease in carbon emissions by 25,000 metric tons per year, which is roughly equal to $1.5 million of cost savings annually. Moving on to the next slide. The fixed Guideway transit scenario provides the largest regional economic contribution and creates the largest share of jobs that benefit racial and ethnic minorities. This scenario supports over 3,200 jobs annually and reduces unemployment rate by 0.08%. The substantial job opportunities would benefit minorities, and Black workers see the largest employment increase in this scenario. On the next slide, the last scenario, bicycle infrastructure, offers a less expensive way of reducing emissions while still providing an effective regional economic boost. It supports 782 jobs annually, with a total increase of $830 million in GRP and $515 million in disposable income. Of all the jobs created, 49% go to racial and ethnic minorities, with Hispanic workers seeing the largest gains. Workers with lower educational attainment are also benefited from this scenario. Finally, the reduction of carbon emissions would be about 5,000 metric tons per year. Now I'm turning it back to Federico for some final remarks. Federico?
Sure. Thank you, Alice. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is that sort of the theme that we see here is that this analysis demonstrates the viability of extending a regional input-output framework to capture not only the economic contributions, but also the social equity, workforce, and environmental outcomes. And the second point is that we see this type of analysis as being potentially useful for policymakers and transit agencies to evaluate projects, which is especially important as federal agencies focus on a broader set of contributions when assessing and funding infrastructure projects.